This is the story of David. In the city of Bethlehem, where Ruth lived, Jesse made his home. Jesse was the grandson of Ruth, and he had many sons. One day Samuel came to Bethlehem in search of a new king. Samuel came to the house of Jesse because God told him that the king would be there. Jesse brought 6 of his sons to Samuel, but the new king was not among them. Samuel asked, "Are there any more sons?" "Yes, there is David, the youngest, who was keeping the sheep." When Samuel saw him, he knew at once that David was the king he was looking for. So he took his horn full of oil in this container and poured it over David's head to make him the new king. This was very confusing because there was already a king in Israel, King Saul. But Saul had changed. An evil spirit tormented him. Still, David could not rule until Saul died. Saul's sickness became worse, and someone suggested he needed music to feel better. So David, the shepherd boy, was brought to play the harp and sing songs to soothe the king. Some of David's songs can be found in the book of Psalms. While David was still a young boy, there was a war in the land. The Philistines wanted the land for themselves. The army of the people of God and the army of the Philistines lined up ready to fight. A very tall man, like a giant, came to challenge Saul's army. His name was Goliath. No one wanted to fight him. When David heard the challenge, he went forward to fight Goliath. They tried to put the armor of the king on him, but it was too heavy. David cast it aside and went against Goliath with 5 smooth stones, his sling, and his shepherd's staff. He killed the bears and lions to defend the sheep. Why couldn't he kill Goliath and defend the people? And he did. The people never forgot David's bravery. And when he grew up, he became a soldier in the army of the king. Now, King Saul had many sons. One of them was named Jonathan. David and Jonathan became very close friends. Jonathan always stood up for David and tried to protect him from harm, even when his father was the king. The king was very jealous of David. David was a great soldier, and over time he grew more popular than the king himself. This made the king very angry, so that he wanted to kill David. Jonathan spoke to his father about David and told him that David was a good man, but Saul would not listen. Jonathan knew that the only way for David to be safe would be for him to run away and hide from King Saul. This meant that 2 friends had to say goodbye. King Saul and his sons led the army against the Philistines once more. This time he and his sons were killed. David moved through the land with his army, and a young man came to him with the news that King Saul and his sons were dead. When David heard the news, he was very sad. David never forgot his friend Jonathan. And later, when he was crowned king, he brought Jonathan's own son to live with him and to eat at his table, and gave him the land that belonged to King Saul. It was time for David to be king. The young man brought David the king's crown, and all the scribes of Israel came to Hebron and made him king, saying, "You shall shepherd over your people." At this time, David was 30 years old, and he would be king for 40 more years. One of the first things that King David did was to go to the city of Jerusalem and take it from the Jebusite people. So now there was a city of David in Bethlehem and a second one in Jerusalem. David remembered that the ark had been lost to the Philistines. He led his army against the Philistines and defeated them. They went to get the ark and brought it to Jerusalem. The king danced in front of the ark as it was carried to its place where the tent had been like it had been in the desert. David wanted to build a house for God, a more beautiful place for the ark, but God said no. David was a king of war. His son Solomon would build it. Now, in the spring of the year when kings go to fight wars, David sent his army away, but remained in Jerusalem. One afternoon he saw Bathsheba, the beautiful wife of Uriah the Hittite. He wanted her for himself. And so he sent Uriah the Hittite into battle where he was killed. Then King David married Bathsheba. One day the Lord sent a prophet to David. His name was Nathan. Nathan told King David, this parable. A rich man and a poor man lived in the same town. The rich man had many sheep. The poor man had only one little lamb that he raised as his pet. He even let it eat off of his plate and drink from his cup. It slept on his lap. The lamb was like one of his own children. One day, someone came to town to visit the rich man. The rich man didn't want to kill any of his own sheep to serve the visitor, so he took the poor man's lamb and served it instead. David was furious at the rich man in the story. As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over because he did this thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, "You are the rich man. God has given you everything, but you took Uriah's wife for yourself." David was filled with sorrow. He wondered if he would die like King Saul. David did not die, but the first son he had with Bathsheba did die. David and Bathsheba were both filled with sorrow, and the next child they had lived. They named him Solomon, and he would become the next king and would build the house for God. King David was not a perfect king, but he understood that, and he asked God to forgive him, and God did. When David was full of years, he died and was buried in Jerusalem. His son Solomon continued to rule over the kingdom and build the temple. I wonder what part of the story you liked best. I wonder what part was the most important. I wonder what part was about you. What part you were in. I wonder if we could leave out any of the story and still have all the story we need. This was the story of David.